Building a Gender Just and Sustainable Pacific, organized by the Pacific Islands Climate Action Network, PCAN, with contributions for a number of regional partners. This session will provide an overview on the impact of climate change on vulnerable groups, such as women and girls, persons of diverse sexual and gender identities, and people living with disabilities. It aims to identify inclusive adaptation and mitigation policies that would strengthen a gender-just, rights-based, resilient, and sustainable Pacific. I am Kavitha Naidu, an international human rights lawyer working on feminist climate justice in Asia and the Pacific, and I'll be your moderator for this session. I would like to acknowledge that I'm dialing in from the stolen Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, or Sydney, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. The fight for climate justice is led by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and I'd like to pay tribute to the work of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples fighting to protect their country. This session will have a series of presentations by a remarkable panel of speakers joining us today. And this will be followed by a Q&A from the audience. And we'll have about 20 minutes available. So I do encourage you to please use the chat function for any questions that you may have. And it's with great pleasure I introduce our first speaker today, Ms. Noeleen Nambulival. My apologies, Noeleen. She's the founding director of DIVA for Equality, co-lead for Global Action Coalition on Feminist Action for Climate Justice, moderator of Women Defend Commons Network, and Pacific Feminist SRHR Coalition. The floor is yours, Noeleen. Noeleen, you're on mute.
Yes, I'm muted, so you probably didn't hear anything I said for the last minute, but basically I said I love PowerPoints only because I'm a very visual person, but also because it keeps me on track. So Kavitha, if you can yell at me at about 9 minutes, I think they've said 10 minutes for our speakers, and I'll get off as soon as you tell me. So I'm speaking on behalf of Diverse Voices in Action for Equality, but also a range of networks and coalitions and social movements within which we operate as DIVA for Equality, and myself personally as a Pacific woman and as a feminist activist and as a lesbian. So there's many identities that I hold, and so my my organizing also therefore is in many different spaces, the same as many of you. I've been asked to kind of speak around feminist approaches, both to address COVID-19, but really the core implications on gender, climate change and disaster risk and response in Fiji, the Pacific, and globally. So that's a big ask in 10 minutes. So what I thought I could do is really just remind ourselves on, like why it is we work in certain ways, maybe as Pacific feminists, and others in the room can speak from that in the discussion. The second bit was really just reflecting on what that frame might mean, and certainly what it means for DIVA for Equality and many of the organizations with whom we work. And maybe what it's not. And then the third one is just sharing some of the strategy and tactics that we might use. What does a response like this look like then? If we keep using these words like feminist approaches, what might that look like? And the last one is, if we're to think about where we are right now, there's kind of three things that are in my mind right now. One is like the absolute urgency. The second is, how do we do both sets of work that are about breaking what isn't working and building what is useful? And how do you do that at one and the same time, when often it's the same people that you have to be doing both with? And that's a delicate dance that we have to find a balance to do that. And the third one is, if we're talking about issues of North and South and many of the power plays that we have in our day-to-day lives as people, but also in this work for climate justice and for ecological justice, how do we do this in many worlds? How do we work outside, as Reverend James said this morning, so that we're not in our small bubbles, but we're working broader? And one of the first things that we always do is make sure our context is clear. And the reason why you see these two little pink arrows is because on Sunday we were doing some work with some organizations of feminists in Timor-Leste. And so when you see how close we are to each other, you know, how some of our issues are similar, but also that there are contextual differences even within this amazing, wonderful place that we call home in the Pacific. And then, you know, when you start moving outward into the rest of this living planet, what looks different in our responses dependent on where we are in the world. Because one of the things that we talk about is feminism and feminisms. And we're really clear at DIVA. We've now been around for 10 years, and we want to talk about patriarchy, and we want to talk about power and unequal and gendered power and how that's, you know, in the world. What does that look like in the world? But if you look at the bottom of this triangle in this kind of little cloud that I put in there, sometimes it's people who aren't even looked at as being part of the gender binary. So we say men and women, girl and boys, you know, we do this binary. But what about non-binary people? What about transgender people and cis people, those who are born with biological characteristics that match their gender? What about those who aren't? How about people who have indigenous expressions, Fa'afine, many of the others that don't fit into LGBTQI categories, for instance? And how do we talk to each other as different bodies around the world? How do we make sure that we're working for liberation and equality for all of us, not just those who we think are good people or people that we like? And one of the things that we do a lot of in feminism is we talk about the COIN model. And so we talk about issues of privilege and oppression. And basically, if you wanted to boil it all down and not spend too much time because it's a short session, you know, we could do a whole day or 3 days on this. What we're trying to do is to say there are things that are better or worse, easier and harder about your life, about my life, because of the body that we're born into, because of the ways that we are in the world. And then it's not so easy to just say white people are like this, or brown people are like this, or indigenous people are like this, or non-indigenous people are like this, but that there are intersectionalities that we have to talk about. And these intersectionalities are everything from class to disability and ability, to what color your skin is, to whether you are a settler or an indigenous person, to whether you are heterosexual or you're not, and the many variances inside that as well. So this is part of our work, is to kind of say, you could be a woman with immense power within our society. You could be an indigenous high chief, and you could go home and be, you know, and be beaten every night. And that reality, the negotiation of your identities, is what we have to think about in terms of COVID, in terms of climate change, in terms of social and economic justice. It's all in there for every issue. So if feminists are trying to defend a living planet, then one of the things that we have to ask ourselves is, we do a lot of commodifying, yeah? Turning everything into money and saying, we value this in certain ways. We even do that in terms of different value systems. We do it in terms of religion. We do it in terms of ethnicity. There's all kinds of value systems operating. But one of the things that brings us together as humans is that there are particular conditions, healthy well-being conditions, that are necessary for all of us. Doesn't matter who we are, and also they're necessary for other species. This is a complex web from the tiniest to the whole planet. So those things that we have to think about are everything from coral reefs to ocean to air to soil to water. And I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but I'm saying that sometimes we forget that when we are in our own bubble of work, is that we say as feminists that one of the approaches is that we want to get into that deeper, darker, wonderful, nuanced set of work and say, what are those things that we want to hold on to as people, and the others that we say are archaic and old and maybe are time to let go as humans. We built these systems, we can also undo these systems and build anew. Because let's face it, Fiji and others in the Pacific have some of the highest rates of violence against women and gender-based violence against LGBTQI people in the world. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but the impacts are huge. There's all kinds of impacts on the body, on our institutions, on our society. And if you look at our first baseline research that we did in Fiji, what we know is 84% of LBT, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people and gender non-binary people have experienced physical violence. And this is then violence by their intimate partner, but there's also violence by families, violence by the state, economic violence, whether or not you can get a job just because of what you look like. And I would say be careful when we're talking about justice, climate or otherwise in the Pacific, because there's 6 countries and territories where we still have illegal discrimination, where it's still illegal to be homosexual in those countries. So there's a lot of work to do. So we know where a lot of the problems are. We know that we're hollowing out the earth. You know, these are not things that I have to talk to you more about. But one of the things that maybe we should pause for a minute is to say corporatization of governance means that we should be very careful, because those who are in corporations around the world have as much power, if not more, than our nation states. But often when we're dealing with them, we pretend like they don't have that level of power and authority and control and access to our governments, access to our civil society, access to our businesses, many, many institutions, to our religious groups as well, all sorts. So societies and nation states are not the only priority, and we need to regulate and bring corporate power under control. And why? Because our debt, for instance, in Fiji has gone up to around 87%, I think we're at now, from around 40% of our GDP. And what about the fact that almost no people in the economic south, there are countries with absolutely no vaccines, and yet we have those in the rich countries around the world, the same people who say that they are with us on ethnicity and climate change, but they are also keeping people who are brown and indigenous, people from around the world, from accessing vaccines. So those sorts of inequalities we need to look at in a holistic way, and not just what we want to look at in a siloed system. Because if we don't, then we find ourselves in a place where we have 8 men who own more wealth, not then 50% now, but 60%. And we end up in a world that isn't about climate change, it's about ecological disaster, about ecocide. Am I still okay? I can hear people in the background. I'm still okay? Yep.
Yeah, Nolene, go ahead.
All right, thank you, thank you. Because I'd be worried if it was there, because I've still got a few slides to go. So the urgency is there. This is the man who brought us the kind of chlorofluorocarbons from the Kyoto protocols about 25 years ago. And now they're saying, look, we don't have decades. We have the next few years to get off our addiction to fossil fuel. Because if we don't, then we're going to have a lot more people who are suffering, not just here in the Pacific and not just in the ways that we're thinking, but food security and sovereignty, about health, about water and sanitation. All kinds of things are going to be in even deeper danger if we don't steepen our curve on transformative reform. So what does that mean when we have things like the high-level political forum and the SDGs, right? We were in there fighting. And one of the stories I tell is I was in the very first open working group where there was Saudi Arabia and others who were saying climate change has nothing to do with sustainable development goals. Here we are, as Pacific governments, we fought, as South countries we fought, but now we have to say, make sure that you are doing that work when we talk about different sustainable development goals, not just what you want to look at, but at things like climate change, at things like inequalities within and between countries. There's a reason why certain SDG goals were pushed, both by least developed countries, by small island states. And so one of our campaigns is around, let's get from the reform to the transformative change, because we just don't have the time to be doing that. What does that mean? That means do all the sets of work, do all the changes at individual level, do all the changes in our households, but remember that we have to look at climate disaster as a result of what we can call unfettered or radical or neo-colonial capitalism. And we have to be clear that we want to break some of that, and we want to build alternative systems. And we have to look back at what was already working before we ourselves got, colonized and taken from many of the right practices, of the good practices in our lives. Okay, so the path seems to be clear, right? But the political will is not, obviously, because anyone who you're asking to take away some of their power and control, whether this is men with women, whether this is straight and non-straight people, whether this is about us as human beings and the way that we treat other species on the planet, anytime we want to change, people find it very, very difficult. So how do we do that? If we're talking about the ways we do it, some of the ways we do it is we measure differently. The top three parts of our economy, we are very clear on how to measure. We think we know about the private sector. We think we know about the public sector. Maybe we think we know about markets for change and some of the informal micro enterprise. But what about the care economy? What about who's the first person? Usually women, usually LGBTQI people, those at the bottom of the totem poles, who are the ones who wake up the earliest, go to bed the latest, who are 2 to 3 times more doing the care work, not just within households, but also within villages, within informal settlements, within churches. These are the people who we have to be measuring in a different way. Because then when we design societies, we don't design the societies as if they have a value. They get to be elder and they are the ones who are in trouble, whether it's by COVID, whether it's by climate change, because we're not listening to them again. And yet they've spent their entire lives building up and maintaining all of our systems. We also know that 70 to 90% of our frontline carers, they're women and girls. So we have to be clear that who we are creating this society for must be for all of us who are doing the work in our own communities every day. It's not about charity or philanthropy. It's about changing the way that we look at development and saying, no more we want to have this pyramid with humans at the top and everyone down below, and particular humans, but we want to be more caring and recognize people and reduce and redistribute work within our communities and within our societies. Because let's face it, Diva and someone like us, we can do different kinds of work, right? We can say we have a feminist approach, but if women can't feed themselves right now, if 30% more women are now have malnutrition and their babies are having malnutrition, then we have to be very clear that our work has to be on urgent response and loss and damage, about the daily realities of people, because we have to be able to do both the structural change, yes, but the material everyday work as well. Okay, so what does that look like? That means that we're doing all kinds of work. I'm not going to focus on that slide because I want to show you some of the work that we're doing. But I do want to say that it's about crisis response and mutual aid as much as it is about research and analysis and advocacy campaigns. You have to be able to move between different sets of people. You have to be able to talk about the industrialized and the developing world. We have to be able to talk about patriarchy and its enablers and heteronormativity, because otherwise we're just asking for more of the same. We're just saying, okay, within this current system, we are going to make it a bit more just. No, there are many, many tables that need to be overturned because they are not working for people who work hard all their lives, who want to be part of community, who have a right to have both direct voice, right? To be able to be heard, whether it's on COVID or on climate change, to be able to have economic justice within our systems, to be able to call for things like a poor people's response to COVID or to climate. That might mean things like a rent and a foreclosure freeze. It might mean pop-up vaccination tents and government working better with civil society to make sure that people can access services. All of these things need to be reconfigured. And so we push all the time to be able to have a say and to demand that it's not a charity or philanthropy when we go to conferences, that we go in with a critical eye because we want to be heard as different kinds of voices and communities, to do it with love and with empathy, but to insist that we are in the rooms where there's a lot of people who, because they have a piece of paper or something after their name or before their name, that they think that other people don't have the right to be speaking when they have an enormous set of lived knowledge about it. So we build bases from organizing. We do a lot of of resistance work. Sometimes, for instance, if we've got to stand against another government and we're in front of their consulate, then we're going to get targeted by a government. So we have to have people behind us who are helping us if we get pulled in for speaking our mind and organizing in resistance. And we have to have those national conventions. There's a lot of things that happen in our capitals that don't go anywhere near where they should be in rural and remote communities. And we can't keep saying it's too hard. It's not too hard. It just means that we have to think in different ways, and we have to be clear that when we're doing that work, that's the absolute core of climate change work, is constituency. Are we speaking from constituency? Are these people with whom we know intimately what our issues are? Are we in solidarity with them so that when we are speaking with each other, we are speaking to each other as whole human beings? Is it because we are protecting each other's ecosystems? And is it because we are in mutual aid and networks? And I know a lot of people don't like to hear this because it's challenging to hear that we demand as transgender people, or we demand as young people, or we demand, but we should be open to hearing those demands. If we're too soft and fluffy about it, let's be clear what Martin Luther King said: power does not move without it being pushed. And so that requires that some of us who maybe are not listened to, or people are not open to having us in rooms, please get used to us asking assertively that we have a right to be in those rooms. That means that sometimes it's about taking care of the bodies. Many systems are set up and then no care is taken. No commodities given to women who are in rural villages. And then a lot of people speaking from a faraway place saying we should do this and we should do that. Okay, go ask, go work. Go take the commodities to the places that require them. Sometimes, for instance, it might be building a bridge somewhere, and you can make some gender justice tweaks in that environment. This is a gender non-binary person working with young women from the village on a bridge. When people often say to us, no, Diva, you can't go in there and change communities. Communities know what is justice, and they know what they want to work with. So I think we have to be a little more, sometimes the elite are the ones that stop things from happening because they say things can't be done when they can be done. This is young women who've become trained as builders, and they're building houses for other women who don't have money, who can't do the renovations and repair. Why is that not a wonderful thing? Just because they're wearing shorts? That is ridiculous. And we have to think about some of the ways that middle-class society also stops some really wonderful work from being done. Piped water, water and sanitation, toilets and bathrooms, negotiating and disrupting unfair systems. Oh, you can't do this. Okay, then let somebody who can talk to a minister here do that. Let someone who can do something quietly change that. I think it's time for us to be a lot more participative in the way that we use our privilege and oppressions, and not just to say that they exist. That's a poor, blunt instrument. We have to work out how to change that for good in terms of campaigning, advocacy, and policy influence. And the last 3 slides is we're working on food security and water security and things now, because for us, what is the things that women are most afraid of now? It's about how they're going to be able to live literally in the years and decades to come, as those who have the power are not changing quick enough. And so as they're not changing quick enough and we're dealing with them, we also have to be willing to do what this sign says, which is, anytime you try to bury me, I will show you I am a potato. In other signs, they say, I will show you I was a seed. So as DIVA, what we're doing is we're now setting up a rural center where we're also doing a lot more experimental local technologies, where we'll be doing a lot more permaculture and agroecology, where we'll have a medicinal garden and all kinds of experimentations. And we're doing this with local communities in the area so that we can demonstrate that we're trying to keep ourselves thriving and alive and feminist and wonderful as people, while we're also trying to change the world. So our commitment, because we were told that at the end of our session, is just to make sure that we're talking about what to do that's different. So we've got 8 commitments that DIVA for Equality is trying to do as a small organization, trying to work in a big way. We're pushing for more money for other communities, including our own. There's about 10, I think, communities around the civil society groups around the Pacific that we now have helped to get more money to in the next year and a half. We're hosting an online feminist climate justice community of practice. So let us know if you want to join. We have some local to global feminist campaigns that are going on. There is a young women's grassroots leadership network. Get involved in Ganga. Talk to Viva from our organization. I think she's in the room. Guaranteed funding for our Builders Network, also our Eco Center. And the last two is really looking at how we push through some of those white supremacy and structural obstacles for majority South peoples. And that includes here in the Pacific. Every time that we say something about Australia or New Zealand, people get quiet, and they get quiet because there is hyper-developmentalism in our region. And there's a lot of threads of funding that stop people from being open and honest about some of those inequalities that we're feeling from just within our own communities. The good, yes, but also the bad. And then the last one is we're doing some work on gender environment data with those like We Do, IUCN, and others. So I think that's the last slide. And just to say, Tima is putting some resources into the chat. I'm sorry I went so fast, but really it's because we're trying to share with you. If there's anything more than nolene@gmail.com, Viva's email is here too, and we'd love to get in contact with you and build the movement even stronger for change. So thank you. Thanks.
Nolene, it's always a treat when you start speaking, and it's very hard to interrupt you because all of us get so absorbed in what you have to share. So thank you so much for really centering the systems of inequality that are behind the climate crisis and the COVID crisis. Colonialism, white supremacy, racism, our neoliberal economic models, patriarchy, these are all the systems that are exacerbating the inequality and discrimination and the impacts of the most vulnerable people in our societies in the region. I really enjoyed, your very powerful experience sharing of the agency of gender non-binary peoples in our communities who have so much to offer in addressing climate impacts and really having a political voice in protecting human rights for everyone. So it was a great start to this session, and I'm sure everybody enjoyed it so much. And with this, I'd now like to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Milikini Failautusi. She's an activist from Tuvalu working in the areas of youth, climate change, gender, human rights, indigenous rights, and sexual reproductive health rights. Milikini, the floor is yours.
Hi, greetings to you all. Talofa from Tuvalu. Can you guys hear me?
Loud and clear.
Yes.
Just a minute, having technical issues. Okay. Thank you very much, Nolene, for the very comprehensive presentation. Today, I will be speaking on the topic of community resilience. Having all seen and heard from Nolene about all the perspective of climate change and gender lens, I will be specifically speaking on community resilience and how each and every one of the component of community will be empowered and developed in order to develop the community perspective when it comes to disaster and natural hazard. We all know of the exacerbating impacts of climate change and disaster to community, especially girls, women, people with disability, and of the vulnerabilities they face. In order to create a rising tide for a uniting Pacific for climate justice, we should shift our focus into community resilience in its entirety, means the ability of individual communities, organizations, or countries exposed to disaster, crisis, and underlying vulnerability to anticipate, prepared for, reduce the impact of, cope with, and recover from the effect of shocks and stresses without compromising their long-term effects. As you guys all know, I'm working with Tuvalu Red Cross, and The International Federation of Red Cross Red Crescent affirms that the definition requires that resilience can be observed and strengthened at multiple levels. We usually think of a community resilience as something that is different from all the hazard that is happening around. So let us look at community resilience in a nutshell, at the community level, at the household level, at the community level, and also at the local and central governments. When we talk at individual resilience, we look at the resilient individual, which is healthy. He has the knowledge, the skills, competency, and the mindset to adapt to new situation and improve his or her life and those of the family, friends, and community. That resilient person is empowered. When we look at the household level, we look at the household resilience and has members of those who are resilient. When we look at the community level, we look at a community who is resilient and that it strengthens the resilience of its constituents, and that means the individuals in the household. Often that we also look at the local and central governments that can either strengthen or weaken resilience at the individual, household, and community level. And these people, they are responsible for the infrastructure development, maintenance, social service, and applying the rule of law. We cannot achieve resilience if we do not embrace gender in its entirety. It is important that we highlight key elements of community resilience. When we look at the gender roles that can shape vulnerability to climate change, we all know that climate change is a global problem with local impacts. Climate change is also making some hazards such as heat waves, heavy rainfall, and storm surges more frequent and severe. And who are the people who are bearing the burden? Are those who are vulnerable, such as girls, women, those with disability, and the minority groups. Not only are patterns of extreme weather events changing, long-term average in rainfall, sea level rise, and temperature are shifting as well. When this change intersects with factors that increase vulnerability and exposure, such as environmental degradation and people living along coastline, the likelihood of disaster increases, especially for countries such as Tuvalu, which is part of the Pacific. These risks are set to increase in the future, and we don't know what is happening in the near future if we don't tend to this problem, and have the potential to limit the effectiveness of development efforts. Impacts may include all the things that I have shared about, like coastal erosion, food security, increased flooding, enhanced prevalences of diseases, dwindling water resources, and loss of biodiversity, including fisheries. As we all know, that one of our commodity and also our resources that are dear to us, the Pacific, is the oceans. Vulnerability to climate change is socially differentiated. That is, of course, the cause of women and men's vulnerability to climate change are many and varied. Gender intersects with social, cultural, and economic inequalities to create this vulnerability. In many parts of the world, women's unequal access to resources, education, legal protection, decision-making, and power make them more vulnerable to the impact of climate change. For example, lower level of education and literacy to some of the women can limit their ability to access information and support in order to prepare for disaster or adapt to long-term action, climate change. The empowerment of individual and of the development of the pre-protagonists, as I have been mentioned, the individual, the community, and the institution includes, it is of a paramount importance, and they make up the society. So often, we usually fragment it between individual, community, and the institution, which is the government. These three protagonists for social change, they are interdependent in the advancements of human society. This has to be recognized, and also the old paradigm of conflict needs to be shifted. For example, institution demands submission while individual glamour freedom need to be replaced with more profound conception of the complementary roles they play in building a better world. To accept that the individual, the community, and the institutions of society are protagonists of community building and resilience, and to act accordingly, open up great possibility for human being happiness and allow for the creation of environments in which true powers of the human can be released. The principal actors needed to build vibrant community and open community resilience will advance that the individual, the institution, the community need to collaborate in their endeavors to advance human society. There are things that we need to look at it, or the key elements of community resilience. The first one is to assist community to adapt risk-informed, holistic approaches to address the underlying vulnerability. If the community cannot underline or see the underlying vulnerabilities they face, it will be hard for them to cope and adapt to all the changes that is happening. Supporting assessment to capture the needs, risk, vulnerability, and capacity of all the members of the community, as well as the dynamic and complex context in which community exists. And also they need to be supported to develop a solution that can help with all the hazards they face. The other thing is to support communities to self-mobilize and address their vulnerability from their own resources. So often we look at all the money that's being invested by donors, that they are the solution to our own problems. The solution to our own problems is our own resources. It's just for us to know and how to make use of those available resources. Supporting communities to access external support networks, such as the public authorities, civil society, and NGOs. It is important that we know or are able to connect all the community if they needed help from elsewhere. It is also important that community are being accountable, especially public authorities and partners. They are being proactively provided regular report, feedback, information relating to programs, services, and activity that is happening in the community. Because if we empower community, we are also developing community resilience. And community resilience is about a demand-driven, people-centered approach. And the approach, the solution has come from the people, has to come from the people, because they are the one with the resources and the solutions to their own problems. Community resilience is important, and we need to invest in community developments in order to empower, to achieve a gender and sustainable Pacific, as well as people, because people are more conscious of their ecological, environmental, economic, and social well-being. And tackling climate change will be our major priority of the coming years. For the IFRC Strategy 2030, climate change is in the center of its developments and their plans. So it is important that in the national society perspective, climate change is foremost in all their development, because as an organization working in humanitarian sectors, climate change is one of the main important issues that is exacerbating all the other issues that are affecting people. And it is evidence that some women will be more vulnerable to climate change. And imagine if we have other issues such as war and other issues such as also COVID-19. It is also important to know that women are key actors in implementing positive change. Report shows that when we equip women with proper resources, women have the power to help their families and the entire community in order to prepare for disaster and the negative impacts of climate change. Women have a strong body of knowledge and expertise that can be used to address the implication of climate change. They have the skills, the experience, and capacity that needed to harness alongside those of men, that those implementing climate smart disaster risk reduction. Not only we're looking at disaster, but also we're looking at COVID-19 in its essence. COVID-19, its essence, is also one of the global crises that is also affecting people nowadays. Imagine if you're putting together climate change and COVID-19, what will happen to those who are most vulnerable, especially women and the minorities, young women, people with disability, and those who cannot access all the services, informations at this time. Thank you very much.
Vinaka Milikini, that was a really strong reminder of how climate resilience can only work if the existing inequalities are first addressed by those in authority. And this is a common theme, addressing, the full realization of human rights for all people, especially women and girls, in all their diversity, as they're the ones who are facing the brunt of the worst impacts of both the climate and COVID crisis. So your messaging around the need to invest in resilience, but how dependent it is to first address inequalities, is what's really needed to build a sustainable Pacific that we're all working towards. So Vinaka Milikini, that was really powerful. I will now go on to introduce our next speaker, George Koran, who works at the Vanuatu Climate Action Network, VCANS, as a coordinator. George has been working with VCAN for 3 years. VCAN is a consortium of different climate action like-minded organization, which is inclusive of disability organizations as well. George, the floor is yours.
Thank you, moderator. Just want to give a bit background about myself. Yes, my name is George, and I'm currently the coordinator for the Vanuatu Climate Action Network. And also, I am based here at Oxfam in Vanuatu. So my intervention will be very short. As we all know, this two-day summit is about climate justice. And I guess one of the big questions that we all want to answer is how do we ensure that we have a gender just and sustainable Pacific in terms of the climate issues that we are facing. So my point will be very short, and I will be specific on systematic approach with regards to the recovery phase after disaster strikes. So why I am raising this is that with the climate change issue, we are anticipating through the IPCC reports that more Category 5 cyclones will be coming our way. So a systematic approach in terms of including responding to these gender issues with regards to our marginalized groups. So I will be giving some relevant examples for us here in Vanuatu. So in every response evaluation reports, we seem to get the same problems highlighted. Example, logistical delays, monitoring evaluation, and data collection, as well as gender issues. So as you all know, Vanuatu is a very high risk country, and Oxfam has been piloting a blockchain technology that if our advocacy with the national government goes according to plan, it will see to it that the system approach in terms of recovery can be adopted as a model for disaster recovery programs here in Vanuatu. So we at Oxfam in Vanuatu had piloted a cash transfer program for evacuated volcanic victims on Ambai, and currently now we are piloting 3 provinces here in Vanuatu with regards to DC Harold response and COVID-19. Why I am highlighting this is because we have some very good feedbacks from the beneficiaries. And for these 3 provinces, the target group is people with disability, elderly, and single parents. So we have received some very good feedbacks from the beneficiaries, and how this new mode of relief delivering aid is restoring dignity and giving more choice to people with people with disability and the marginalized in our community. So basically, for those who don't know what the cash transfer program is, it is a blockchain technology whereby we utilize to deliver aid, but in the form of cash. So there are different modalities to it. So basically, for this modality, a card is issued to the beneficiaries that they can use to purchase anything that they want to purchase. So I know that the blockchain technology is yet to be legislated and approved in many Pacific Island countries. But for Vanuatu, through the trials that Oxfam had piloted, it is now recognized by the Reserve Bank of Vanuatu. And we are hoping that in the future will be a mode of model of relieving disaster that will ensure that those people with disability and the marginalized are more inclusive inside this response. So in conclusion to my very short presentation, I have seen the impact of this systematic approach in Vanuatu, especially for our vulnerable and marginalized groups. And I do hope that in the future, more countries in the Pacific can legislate and use this program as a mode of delivering aid to communities. And it is not just aid, there are more opportunities to explore in these new technologies that can benefit not only the marginalized group among us, but also the country economically. So yeah, I think that is all from me. I'm happy to take any questions if you have any questions. So over to you, moderator.
Thank you, George. That was a very interesting presentation on this new blockchain technology that is being used as an inclusive platform for vulnerable groups to access humanitarian aid. And so thank you so much for sharing it. And I wish we had more time for you to, share us a lot more about, what some of the challenges are and how it can be an opportunity. So really, really excited to learn about this. And I'm sure many here would be quite keen to learn more about how this can be used in other Pacific Island countries, given the intensity and frequency of natural disasters will inevitably increase in our region. So thank you. And our final speaker for this session today is Naomi Navode. Naomi works as the Gender and Youth Officer for the Pacific Disability Forum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the floor, Naomi.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Bulavinaka, everyone, and Pacific warm greetings from Pacific Disability Forum. I have someone can just assist with my PowerPoint slide. They're supposed to assist me. Put it up for me. Just sure.
We can see it now, Naomi.
Thank you. I've been asked to speak on gender-based violence and emergency on women and girls with disabilities. Next slide, please. Joshua, next slide. Thank you. But first of all, I'd like to talk about how climate change disproportionately impacts those persons with disabilities. For persons with disabilities, we all know that most of persons with disabilities have, yes, of course, are most likely to have limited access to knowledge, resources, and services to effectively respond to environmental changes. For example, most persons with disabilities in the Pacific are not well educated, so they're not aware of the impact of climate change. They don't have any basic knowledge on how about climate change or the resources and services that is available within their community to enable them to adapt to environmental change. It compromises their health because of their disability, and they are vulnerable to a different type of extreme climate events, as well as ecosystem service loss. And of course, there's a high increase of infectious disease on persons with disabilities. In a climate emergency, persons with disabilities may be more vulnerable to contracting the disease or infectious disease because of the underlying conditions that a person has or have, which that don't allow them to move or to be independently access water and sanitation when it comes to access to wash. For example, during TC Winston, we found out that there were disproportionately persons with disabilities were affected or impacted after TC Winston's, and because of that type of impairment, especially for those with person with living with visual impairment, with person with intellectual disabilities, and particularly those women or all person with psychosocial disability. In a climate emergency, and this is very much a reality in the Pacific, in a climate emergency, persons with disability are immobile because of the underlying condition that they have that relates to their type of impairment. That again, they are prone to get any infectious disease from waterborne disease, even in the non-extreme events such as air pollution, health that compromise in the long term. And those with disabilities are more, yes, of course, are more likely to have difficulties during required evacuations and migrations. For example, in a community, if that communities are asked to relocate persons with disabilities with physical impairment, it's going to be difficult for them to relocate because of the environmental barriers in terms of movement from one place to another. Next slide, please. Now we will look at the intersectionality of women and girls with disabilities in GBVIE. We know the multiple intersections of women with disabilities that place them as disproportionately affect risk to emergency, that this is due to systematic inequalities that exist in our societies. And this is a reality for women and girls with disabilities. We know that discrimination and stigma is very high in the Pacific, and it associates with, one, because a person is a woman of their gender, second, she has a disability, and therefore experience a lot of subject to forced medical treatment, including reproductive health procedures without their consent. Women with disabilities, women and girls with disabilities also face multiple barriers seeking assistance when it comes to violence that exacerbate in emergencies when protective structures are broken down. For example, access to services or the communications are weakened, that persons with disabilities or women with disabilities will experience the different challenges and barriers when in accessing those services. Next slide, please. Lack of privacy, overcrowding, lack of safe access to basic needs when they are placed in evacuation centers, where the evacuation centers lack accessibilities of the evacuation centers, the design of humanitarian aid or that increase the risk of new risk of GBVIE on women and girls with disabilities. If they are separated from their family members, if there are lack of documentations, example, medical documentations or registration, because they are definitely experience discrimination on the ground of their disability and because they are women. Yes, definitely there's going to be an increase of their vulnerability with dependence and exploitation in evacuation centers if they are displaced without their family members. There's a need for introduction of new power dynamic to allow humanitarian actors to work very closely with women with disabilities, their representative organization, to address the different challenges and barriers. Next slide, please. So in order to address the challenges and barriers that faced by women with disabilities in gender-based violence in emergency, PDF saw that there was a gap in the past in addressing these very sensitive issues. So we had the opportunity to work very closely in partnership with UNFPA and IPPF in 2019, where we brought together representatives from 9 DPOs, including a member association of IPPF and UNFPA in-country officers that we had a 2.5 days workshop, deliberations, sharings of challenges and barriers, addressing the gaps around GBVIE on women and girls with disabilities. And that brought about the changes during those time to address the different experience that women with disabilities had experienced in GBVIE, or the lack of information in addressing these issues. So there was a need to address this during through these meetings. So we came about through the development of the Dignity Kit for women with disabilities at the outcome of from that 2 days deliberations at that workshops. Next slide, please. The Dignity Kit had provided women and girls with disabilities a range of essential hygiene and sanitation items. As I had alluded to earlier, the partnership between IPPF, UNFPA, and PDF, the Dignity Kit has provide key entry point for the community, especially for women and girls with disabilities during crisis, to understand their needs. For UNFPA, in collaboration together with PDF, and we were able to launch the Adaptive Dignity Kits in December, during the International Day of Persons with Disabilities last year, December 3rd. And currently, UNFPA has repositioned 100 adaptive dignity kits for women and girls with disabilities across the Pacific to be distributed in future emergencies. Next slide, please. This is the pictures of the launch of the Dignity Kit with the representatives from the UN agency, UNFPA, PDF, the government, Disability Focal Point, and person with disabilities, women with disabilities here in Fiji. As a success from the outcome of that workshop in September 2019. Next slide, please. This is women with disabilities receiving their dignity kits, distributing to them last year from the team when they went out to do the assessment after TCA ASA. So they went out to the community and distribute the dignity kits to women with disabilities, as well as the outreach program to the community. Next slide, please. Again, these are pictures of women with disabilities receiving their dignity kits. Next slide. So far, PDF has come a long way in addressing GBVIE and women and girls with disabilities. So therefore, we are currently part of the Pacific Humanitarian Protection and GBV cluster that is led by UN Women, and also part of the Pacific GBVIE cluster led by UNFPA. However, it doesn't end here. We believe that they still have a long way to go, and we need to work together in collaboration to be able to address the different challenges and barriers that is faced by women with disabilities in GBVIE. And what can we do to be able to address the different challenges and barriers around GBV and women and girls with disabilities? We have a following recommendation that we would like to propose to the drafting committee as the outcome from this climate change summit, Madam Moderator. We'd like to see that to strengthen the capacity of persons with disabilities, especially women with disabilities, so that they can access the resources needed to adapt to climate change. We need to engage persons with disabilities, including women with disabilities, in climate change public investment plan to ensure that no one is left behind from this investment. Cooperation is very important between different line ministries and donors to bear responsibility of budget allocations towards organizations of persons with disabilities to address the different challenges and barriers around climate change. Yes, we need to promote disability budget on climate change through media dialogue. We also need to be inclusive in our research around gender and disability as a cross-cutting to climate change and GBVIE. Finally, we need to promote disability and gender policy as with inter-ministries and donor partners. Next slide, please. Thank you for having me, and thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please feel free to, I'm happy to answer those questions. Thank you again.
Vinaka Naomi, for your extremely informative presentation where, you know, I think as able-bodied people, we tend to not be informed about the increased risks and vulnerabilities of persons living with disabilities, particularly in situations of emergency and natural disasters. So it was really good to understand, you know, at the different levels of the vulnerabilities and risks that persons living with disabilities, particularly those women and girls in evacuation centers, in terms of relocation, long-term resettlement, face. So this was a very, very informative presentation. It really helped put into context how necessary it is for all of us working in different spaces on climate justice to be very inclusive of the vulnerabilities and the rights of persons living with disabilities. And thank you for sharing those recommendations, which I hope, you know, a number of participants have been able to note down and really get involved with in ensuring, you know, just inclusivity of persons living with disabilities in such situations. So thank you. I'm now going to open the floor for any questions that you may have for any of the panelists. So if there is nothing on the chat, which I haven't seen any questions in the chat, but, you know, so if there's anybody in the audience who has a question, please just raise your hand. Feel free to turn on your video, unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and ask your questions. Is there a question that I've missed? Hold on, here we go. Okay, well, I do see one question. Thank you, Steph. My colleague Steph is here as well for pointing me to this. Okay, so there is a question. It's from the Vanuatu participant, Christopher Bartlett. Where do you see the Pacific in 5 years in regard to addressing inequalities for vulnerable groups? And what should be prioritized if given only one option? Which of the panelists would like to answer this one? Nolene, I'll ask you to go on this one. What should be prioritized? My goodness, that's a tough one.
So you know, anytime that anyone goes, give me one, I'm like, no, we can't do that. But we can do maybe an all-round answer. So I'll do a quick one. Really, if I was to say, you know, what I really hope for us to be able to accomplish together that will really have an impact on people's lives, it would be, how do we reconfigure states and societies so that we can truly work for universal human rights? And that means that we have to look at, you know, there's a lot of emphasis right now on trying to do, you know, what they're calling feminist foreign policy or progressive foreign policy. I want to look at domestic policy equally, if not more, because what I'm interested in and what feminists are interested in for decades is, how do we really recognize, first look at it in the face, and then how do we reduce, and then how do we redistribute work within our societies? And the last one is then, how do you reconfigure policies? Because if our societies and our states are not working for all of us, if they're not for us all, then it doesn't matter if we're working on violence or poverty or economic justice or ecological justice or climate change, the results still won't be for everybody, right? So the last thing I want to say is, if we look at it from an embodied rights perspective, if we say everything we do as organizations, as governments, if we look at the individual bodies of people and work out how they are and are not being empowered and provided with, you know, what they require for free, full, active lives, then we're not going to make it, because it's a really, really difficult set of challenges that we're facing. And the last one is, for DIVA, for the last 10 years, we're now 10th anniversary year. And the main thing we're thinking about is, how do we make sure that we're always doing the material with the structural, that we can look each other in the eye as people and say, I care about what's happening to you today, and I care about what's happening in the system. If we can do those two, like, at least it's going some way. Thank you.
Thanks, Nolene. Brilliant answer. And this is true. I'll just add a bit to this as well. You know, as feminists working in climate justice, we demand system change. We recognize that looking for solutions in our current systems is unsustainable, because we are replicating the same models that are creating the inequality and discrimination to begin with. For instance, you know, a good example is looking for tech fixes as climate solutions, technology being the answer to, you know, fix climate injustices. But that's not true, because most technological solutions are in fact about greenwashing and making profit. It's about exploitation of resources and labor from the global south. So this is where it's really important for us to have that deeper analysis about exactly how are we challenging the system to changing it. What's our alternative? And, you know, it's a good idea to look at, you know, a number of Green New Deals. We look at decolonial feminist Green New Deals, and it's really pulling together the different threads of racial justice, economic justice, trade justice, and coming up with alternative solutions. And that then gives you an idea about, there is not one priority. Everything is a priority in order for this to change fundamentally. Radical transformation is what we look for. So great question, and thank you. So now we've got tons of questions, which is very, very exciting. So I have a question, and I knew somebody was going to ask this question. I'm glad you did. There's a question for George, and it's, can you please explain the use of blockchain technology in cash distribution? George.
Thank you for the question. So the question is, what is the blockchain technology in terms of cash distribution? So basically, for the DC Harol and for COVID-19, Oxfam in Vanuatu had received some funding from its donor partners. And so basically what we do is we injected the donor funds into a big account here in our bank here in Vanuatu. So what happens is that we issue we first out selected the beneficiaries for this recovery for DC Harol. So the beneficiaries are, like I mentioned earlier, only the people with disability and elderly and single parents. So what the Oxfam team had done is they engaged partners and stakeholders, and they've identified the beneficiaries, and then we work with the private sector, the Vanuatu Business Resilience Council, to identify the vendors that will be providing the services to these beneficiaries. So what happened is that Oxfam issue some cards to these beneficiaries. So the card is being refinanced every month. So what happened is the beneficiaries just take the card and they go to the vendors, and also they purchase anything that they would want to purchase with the assistance that have been coming through. So yeah, that is what they have. We have the modality itself. They have different models within the cash transfer itself. So this is only just one model, which is the cash transfer, but we also have different models like cash for work. But the one thing that I would like to highlight is that there are some certain conditions that has to be in place before this approach can be taken up. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, George. So I'm qualified because there is some good technology that's working out there for the people. So this is where we need to look at, you know, what really works and what's ticking the human rights boxes and what's not. So this is great. I've got another question here. Is there a certain age group that is most vulnerable in the Pacific? Milikini, I'll open this question to you since you work so much on community resilience.
Thank you very much, moderator. I have looked at a couple of questions quite related to community resilience. And during my presentation, I was talking about the individual, the community, and the institutions. When it's in its entirety, it means the government. And as an individual, we are the ones who are forming up communities. And we usually demand for climate, for systems change, climate justice, gender justice, and all those other issues that we are affected or most affected by it. And we cannot change those things if the individual doesn't change, because so often we are associated with the norms, the society, the cultures that we have been brought up with. And these are some of the contributing factors that changes the way we see things and the lenses we see things. And for looking at what is the certain age that is most vulnerable in the community, from my understanding, everyone is vulnerable in their own stage. Even if you're a girl, if you're a man, in terms, if you cannot access resources, services, even though if you're a muscular man, that's mean you are vulnerable if you cannot access all those resources for the benefit of your own status. So that's mean we always look at children, women, people with disability as the one who are vulnerable, because there are other factors that blocking you from accessing those services and informations that are available. So that's how I see or classify those who are vulnerable in the Pacific. Take, for instance, the presentation that came from Naomi about people with disability. Everyone has their own capacity, they have their own potential, but it's just that of the ability that they cannot assess or accept all those things that are available in society makes them vulnerable. Looking at community resilience in the sense that if these three components of individual, the community, and the institutions are not working together or collaborate together interdependently, that means we will be experiencing a lot of threats, a lot of difficulties, a lot of problems within the society, because all those three components are working together. If they're not working together, we are experiencing a lot of gender inequalities, a lot of issues when it comes to health issues, a lot of disaster, in the sense that we don't know how to adapt, how to cope with the existing threats. And also there are hazards or risks that are we affecting every day in our everyday life. But as climate change came into being, it will be an existential threat into our lives, because it's something that has been imposed into our lives as we're already facing our own problem within our own families, our own society, our own culture, which that we're facing every day. I think that's my contribution, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Milikini. I think what I'll do is I'll cluster some of these questions together. So the next one is about what can be done at the community level to bring about a gender just, sustainable Pacific, particularly looking at some of the challenges in the midst of the COVID crisis. In other words, how do we achieve the new Pacific platform for action for gender equality and women's human rights, 2018 to 2030? Panelists, Naomi, would you like to share your response from women living with disabilities and what some of the challenges are in achieving this?
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I'll speak from my perspectives as a woman with disabilities. The challenges is the attitudinal barriers of the communities towards women with disabilities. The mindsets of the communities, even as family members. In the Pacific, this is very much common. And the biggest challenges is addressing these barriers. We need to change the attitudes and mindsets of the family members, the communities, even the the institutions that to be able to address the different layers of discriminations and stigma that women with disabilities experience or live with in their communities, because women with disabilities, the vulnerabilities triples because the different layers of discriminations that they experience within their communities. And it's about working together. It's about the states taking the lead. It's about the obligations of the states to address the different attitudinal barriers, the different layers of discrimination that women and girls with disabilities in the community. It's also about engaging women with disabilities at the community level to be able to address the different challenges and barriers, the attitudes and mindset that women with disabilities experience within the community. It's about engaging with their representative organizations. It's about working together to be able to address this at the community level. Thank you.
Thanks, Naomi. Nolene, I'll flip this question to you in terms of what do you think? I think all of us are very much aware about the numerous challenges we're facing in doing this work at the community level. What do you think are the opportunities of doing this work? How do we achieve this? You're on mute. You're on mute. Naomi, Nolene.
Sorry, I'm always doing. Maybe that's one thing. The opportunity is to kind of realize that, you know, every time a new challenge comes up, we have to find another way to work. So for those of us, for instance, we've built our entire set of kind of politics around face-to-face interaction and making sure that, you know, that we are localized and we are trying to be with each other in community. And then here we are in COVID, and we've got to start working in ways that maybe at first seem really kind of challenging, but also that don't seem, you know, like they're going to take us where we need to go. So within DIVA, we've been working a lot on that. So I think there is something around, because what often happens is, again, you have to work on the issues of elitism. You have to kind of go, okay, who can't get onto the Zoom, you know, who can't get onto the Zoom platforms? And my goodness, I don't know about any of you, but I'm sick of all the different kinds of platforms that we have to try to, you know, deal with now in our daily work, but we have to learn it. And so there's some of our crew who are, you know, like, yeah, okay, we couldn't stand it a few months ago, but now we feel like we're having to get a hold of it. So that's one thing, Kavita. And the only thing is I'm distracted because I really love the question about decolonization and women. So in a minute, that's why I was scribbling away madly.
You can answer it right after this.
Yes, sorry. So I maybe I'll leave that in just to say, like, opportunities is a weird thing to raise, because that's also about privilege and oppression, right? Like, if something looks like an opportunity to you, then probably you have a bit more challenge, you know, you probably have a bit more resources in order to do something about it. Whereas someone who's really, really struggling through every single day and trying to put, you know, really just the bare minimum of food on the table, they're not feeling like this is opportunity time at all. So it's just kind of remembering that when we're working is something to us. You know, it's that empathy, working from a position of empathy. Thanks. That's all I have to offer on that.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Nolene. So George, there's a few questions for you. So I'll bring this back to you, and Nolene, you can think about the decolonizing question in the meantime. So George, and thank you, Francis, for clustering these questions together. So do you see that blockchain technology in terms of finances is more inclusive for everyone? And can you ensure that blockchain is gender sensitive at the community level? You're on mute too, George. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. For the pilot project that we've been running here in Vanuatu in terms of sensitizing this program inclusive of different genders. So as I already did mention earlier, the beneficiaries for this program that Oxfam and its partners had implemented, they specifically target the people with disability and the vulnerable groups. So these are the only benefits that the program is sure to respond to them. But yes, for sure, we can. There are different modalities that we can incorporate into this platform, taking into consideration the different genders also. But these are the people that through the work of Oxfam, we have identified that with the COVID-19, with the closure of borders and businesses are shut down. So this is something that it's also ensuring injecting cash into the local economy, since these cash are going to be spent wherever these beneficiaries are in the community. Some of them are in the islands, so the vendors that they will be spending this cash will be the vendors within their own areas as well. So again, it is a program that it's being piloted, and yeah, it is not yet recognized by our national government, but now through the impact of the program, we are envisioning that in the future, hopefully, it will be something that the government will consider as a mode of delivering aid, but this will be more to do with the recovery phase, as I mentioned, not in the immediate response of disasters, but in the recovery phase, as I mentioned, that it also has an economic connotations to it as well. So yes, like I mentioned earlier, it is something that it gives back dignity to the beneficiaries. It is not something that people will be lining up to get the supply. So you have a card in your wallet, so you just go anywhere in the shop, and people will not, especially the beneficiaries, will not feel stigmatized within the community as some people who are receiving aid and things like this. So it also gives the choice, and it's also reduce the logistical logistical support that many recovery programs have been facing difficulties with. So yeah, this is a short contribution that I can contribute.
George, that's really wonderful. I think, your message about it protects the dignity of people trying to access aid. I think that's such a new and innovative way of looking at really, the loss of dignity through crisis situations is such a, it's such an intimate and personal things for those who are facing the worst impacts of these challenges. So that's a really wonderful way of looking at this blockchain technology as being more accessible and inclusive. And George, I think you need to put your email address in the chat group, because, people obviously really, really want to know more about this and how it can be used in the Pacific. So please do share your email. And those of you who want to know more, do contact George. I mean, this is a platform where we connect. So this is a great opportunity. There's a question here that I'm going to ask Milikini, because I think it's a great question. So here we go. Representation of marginalized groups, women, people with disabilities, youth, LGBTQI+, in decision-making bodies, including climate risks and negotiation discussions, are lacking. In the Pacific, where sociocultural traditional systems can also work against this movement, how do you see ways around these?
Thank you very much. That is a very, hard questions. And
it is.
Yes, it is. From the experience of me working in the area of young people, especially youth, it is quite hard for us to be in this kind of spaces because of the continent we're coming from, especially the Pacific. We're actually shrinking from Asia Pacific, from the Asian country, especially when it comes to all those negotiations, discussion, when we go to COP21 or other conferences around the world. But now we are moving into the new normal where everything is virtual. This is something that the young people and other groups need to make use of all the available platform and avenues that we are using now because of COVID-19, thanks to COVID-19. But within the Pacific, I'm going to talk specifically for Tuvalu because I'm from Tuvalu. Sometimes the social culture traditional system existing in the country It's something that hinders the participations of young people and other minority groups to be part of all these decision-making bodies because of the culture that we face, the undermining of the representation and participations of young people and this group within this kind of settings, as well as usually youth are taken as a token of participation just for sake of ticking the box, but not in the sense that, of course, we encourage the voices of young people to be heard. Sometimes that is the mindset that people or young people are facing. But on the other side, young people have been giving a lot of spaces to be participated. But it's just a matter of encouragement and empowerment into the young people in order for them to be able to actively participate. So it's kind of a way of two things that we are facing at the moment. People are giving space to be participated, but at the same time, some people, some young people are not making use of the spaces that are being provided because of the misconceptions around participation and also the influence of cultures and mentalities within the Pacific, specifically for Tuvalu. So in order for young people to be an active voices, especially when it comes to this climate negotiation and risk, we need to create clear platforms in the country or at the national level in order for the young people to feel empowered. And also one of the things that we need to, especially within Tuvalu, we really need to develop is the capacity to have a national movement that really gears specifically for climate justice movements and also a gender justice movement. And that is one of the things that is lack within the national level, and which is something that, because we have 350 Tuvalu, we have Tuvalu National Youth Council, but we really need the empowerment and development of all this, organization so that they may be able to build the capacity of the national youth in order for their voices to be heard, not only at the national level, but also at the regional and international level. Thank you.
Thanks, Bilikini. That was a very wholesome answer to, how do we look at these challenges? And if you look, there's been more questions coming in, particularly from the Vanuatu Hub. Excellent questions. So panelists, please feel free to reply just on chat, because we are unfortunately running out of time, even though this has been such a rich discussion. But for the last question, Nolene, because this is about, a gender just and sustainable Pacific. So I'll give this, it is for you. So here's the question. Women are often double colonized by the colonizers of their nations and also by patriarchy. And this has often stopped them from realizing that they can be powerful elements of change in their communities, especially in rural areas. Do you think our governments are doing enough to decolonize these women? If not, what do you think can be done?
Oh, what a question. And even if you deconstruct the question, it's a wonderful thing. So I'm just going to go quickly. And thank you, Christel. Governments can never decolonize anybody because they themselves come out of a system. If you look back at where states come from, you see that they come from a particular Westphalia system. They come through a European, Judeo-Christian background, and then other states that don't come from other sets of knowing over centuries, right? Over millennia and centuries and then years. And so governments will never do that. So we do the decolonizing of ourselves, and we help others to decolonize as well. And we are in solidarious action to do that. But we fall over all the time because we ourselves are captured and colonized. So every day that we're living, we have this saying in Diva, which is every morning I wake up and I have to shower and scrape the patriarchy off my body. So that's kind of from the individual. You have to kind of keep thinking about where you yourself are becoming a colonizer and an imperialist and taking others with you. And I think we all have problems with that. Some people have more problems with it than others. So for instance, there are men who are in the hierarchical frame who have a lot more power. So it's very hard for them to negotiate and give up their power. So particular people within a community, let's face it, religious leaders, all kinds of, kind of cultural bodies, those who hold a lot of traditional power, come on, they find it hard to move. So decolonizing our minds, our bodies, our cultural groups, our institutions, our societies, our economics, because all of that comes from bodies of thinking. It comes from ideas, it comes from frames of meaning, and everything that we do every day is political. But all of us like to kind of look at the things that we want to change and we go, yes, I think that's political, but something else that's also highly political, oh no, we're not going to look at that. So any of us who think that we live in a region where it's fair and equitable, when you have women whose bodies are being violated, where you have LGBTQI bodies that are being violated in huge epidemic proportions, very, very hard for us to talk decolonization. So are states doing enough? Of course not. But is society doing enough? Of course not. Are civil society doing enough? Is SPC doing enough? Is the PIFS Forum? Is the UN doing enough? None of us are. So we have to get real and talk to each other in different kinds of ways. And how can we do that? There are many ways we can do that. And one of them is being embodied. In the ways we talk is to think about whose bodies are implicated and how they're being affected, right? In a good or a bad way. The second thing is we have to be intersectional. All of us have different identities, 100 different identities that we all hold as singular people. So how we then move through the world is important. And the last thing is you've got women from all around the world, feminists from the economic South who've been working on interlinkage analysis for the longest time. Men, indigenous people been doing this too. Been telling us for the longest time, and we never trusted ourselves. We allow ourselves to get into silos. Oh, I work on economics, you work on sustainable development, you work on gender. No way, we all work on the same issues. It's just that we've got to be clear on how we can talk to each other and act with each other in new ways. And the last thing I'd say is how you do that, you form communities of practice and you don't be afraid to be challenged. So if we're all just sitting in our own little bubbles and rooms going, I only like those people, so I'm going to hear from them, then it's going to be very hard for us to come up with new ideas because new ideas come from challenge and conflict. So we have to all become better at conflict transformation, surely. And the last point I put is, men, when you look at George and the rest of them, they're trying to do things in new ways with blockchain. We also are trying to do that. We have unconditional cash transfers. Why we have to have so much say over where poor women will put their money? So we give certain amounts of food aid, we give certain amounts of whatever they want to buy with it. It's not for Diva to tell them how they're going to use their money in a crisis. They know best of all. We set up the parameters and we make sure we have accountability, but we know damn sure they're going to do a better job of deciding what they need for their lives than we do. So we trust that, and that's what trust-based development and funding is about, is trying to get away from this idea that because I have, certain titles and certain epistemologies of knowledge, that someone who doesn't, someone brilliant and beautiful and maybe old and in a traditional part of the world doesn't have as much knowledge as me. That's why we ended up where we are right now. So that's my last little bit, is I think we have to honor different kinds of knowledge in a real way. There's a lot of people who talk the good talk of indigeneity, but when you actually talk about it, how do you deal with intersectional indigeneity? How do you deal with different kinds of people? If you're in an informal settlement in Suva and you've had no capacity to be with your traditional people, those of you who do, please don't stand on their heads and make them feel bad, because that also is colonial behavior. So I think we've got a lot to learn on decolonizing ourselves, and we have to do it if we're gonna change ecological and climate justice for ourselves and for the region and for the world. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, great question. And thank you for such a powerful message, Nolene. And it comes as a perfect close for this session, because I think all of us can agree that we have learned so much from this session, from so many different perspectives and insights, and really build our own knowledge and learning in the process. So my deep thanks to all the panelists for your wonderful presentations and for really engaging with the participants, and to all the participants for your really, really good questions as well. I thoroughly enjoyed myself in this session. I have a quick reminder to all of you. So the next session begins at 2:30 p.m. Fiji time. I think there is a break now. And the two sessions are Where Next for Loss and Damage, Dealing with Risks Beyond Adaptation. And the other one is Rethinking Climate Finance in the Pacific. The links should be posted on the chat group. So, looking forward to those who can join for the next session. And again, thank you, everyone. And I close the session for now. Cheers.
Halo. Halo, Miliki mo te tusanga.
Bye, everyone.
Malo, thank you. Good night.
Bye.
Thank you, Milikini.
Hi, Shirley, Noeline. Sorry.
Long time, looking good, girl.
Have we got the
Are you
links?
there?
Yeah, we've
Yeah.
got the links.
Okay.
Thank you so much, ladies. Thank you so much, panelists. Thank you, George.
Sai, is that you?
Yes, that's me.
Ah,
Thank you. That was
finally we
very
get
good.
to meet. Most welcome.
Yeah.
I hope that ran well.
It really went well, and I loved the questions and the answers. The presentations from the participants the speakers were good. Ace.
Yeah,
Yes.
it was really, really well done. I really enjoyed myself as well. And thank you for having me on
Yes.
board. And I'll try and sign into some of the others. Langi, if you're there as well, good luck with the rest of it, buddy. See you later.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye and
Thank you,
bye,
Kavita.
Kavita.
Bye. Bye.